to the monthly dialogue series hosted by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Kawekazi and I serve as the National Coordinator for SAFSC. So today's webinar is going to be concerning a very important discussion centered around the theme of the ocean commons and food sovereignty. As a part of our ongoing commitment to fostering dialogue on the next food systems, this webinar hopes to delve into the critical issues of ocean sustainability. The depletion faced by the ocean commons due to industrial scale fishing, mining, global warming, and pollution poses a grave threat to our planet's health. The questions we must now confront is how do we stop our oceans from dying, and how do we renew the ocean's food sovereignty commons? The ocean commons are vital for sustaining life on Earth, particularly in the context of food sovereignty, as the primary source of food for a significant amount of people globally. Oceans play a critical role in global food security. Furthermore, they are essential in regulating climate, providing livelihoods for coastal communities, and supporting biodiversities. Today, we are very, very honored to have distinguished panelists who will share their insights and expertise on this pressing issue. Our first panelist is Janet Solomon, who is an environmental and climate activist, artist, and award-winning filmmaker, who's joining us as the elected spokesperson for the Oceans Not Oil Coalition and the political program secretary for the Climate Justice Charter movement. We also have Carmen Mannarino, who is a food sovereignty activist specializing in small-scale fisheries, who's bringing her wealth of experience as a program manager and acting co-director as Masifundise. We will give each panelist time to present, probably like 10 to 20 minutes, after which we will then open the floor for discussion. And before we proceed, I'd like to express our gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us in this very important conversation. Your presence here underscores the significance of addressing these challenges collectively. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Janet Solomon to share her insights on the topic. Janet, over to you.
Thanks, Kawekazi. I'm going to just share my screen, if that's okay. First of all, thank you to the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, and good afternoon to all of you online. Just to say that this presentation represents some of the thoughts that are going into a climate justice oceans policy, and as such, it is open to review and to addition. If we follow the excellent summation on the invitation for today, we're convening to dialogue. I'd like to suggest that this is the beginning of an emergency meeting. We have a loved one who is dying. Their functional and immune systems are breaking down and their vital organs are failing. Yet, we're asking them to get up one last time and prepare us a meal. Ocean life and lives are inseparable from life on the planet and conjoined to all human survival, critical to every single human. And yet the atrocities performed upon and within them all rest on moral underpinnings that promote human material interests as a goal. It is these atrocities that we must bring back from the ambient white noise of the failures and injustices of regulatory frameworks and uneven distribution of benefits and downplayed substantial risks of the sustainable blue growth paradigm, the global ocean commons, shared resource practices that have been largely inattentive to climate adaptation and contributory to massive declines in biodiversity across the board. 90% of global warming is occurring in the ocean. The global average sea level rise from 2022 to 2023 was nearly 4 times the increase of the previous year. As we speak, the most extensive coral bleaching event on record is happening to more than half the planet's coral, 54% and counting 1% every week. Local corals in Isimangaliso, their bleaching is likely to be discernible as early as 2028. except recent research shows high levels of runoff organochlorine pesticides in their soft corals could reduce their resilience. Rapidly melting land ice is introducing fresh seawater into the life-giving ocean circulatory system, meaning that less seawater sinks to the bottom, slowing down the system and threatening its collapse unless we hold global warming to 1.5 degrees C. The current dominating legal framework governing the ocean is the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. Critical review exposes the UNCLOS exclusionary dynamics biased against developing nations, third world, and landlocked countries. Its origins lie in the colonial, paternalistic, open trade and travel jurisprudence, the freedom of the seas, and in the common heritage of mankind principle, wherein the ocean is claimed as joint asset to be shared equitably and intergenerationally under the auspices of a governance system. In practice, this trustee humanist rationale has turned a blind eye to excessive wild capture fishing practice, meaning that in the last 50 years, half of the planet's marine vertebrates, fish, whales, turtles, and a third of sharks and rays have been wiped out, with further population declines through a decreased ability to recover. Over a third of commercial fish species are now overfished or fully fished. Even efforts to forestall future fishery declines using ecosystem-based fisheries management measures will not mitigate end-of-century fisheries collapse or rapid declines projected under the high baseline carbon emission scenarios from 2030 onwards. Also, UNCLOS continues to valorize the minerals of the international seabed as distributive commons, facilitating ever-expanding appropriation into the extractivist mineral energy complex. South Africa's total potential extended continental shelf claim of approximately an extra 940,000 square kilometers will fall under the national jurisdiction under the Socio-Economic Development Initiative, Operation PEKISA, unlocking the ocean economy, which is entrenched in a blue growth approach. The PEKISA program promotes the ocean commons as a key commodity frontier, fostering risk-tolerant economic optimization opportunities with a narrow focus within marine exploitation and its mitigation, whilst deaf to deep systemic transformation. Driven by the vexed notions of sustainable and offshore fossil fuel development, PEKISA has expropriated 85% of South Africa's vast 1.5 square kilometer ocean commons as prospecting and operational acreage. The PEKISA legitimation of the offshore oil and gas alone has seen massive ocean grabbing, displacement, and dispossession, livelihood impacts for small-scale fishers, lost access to the marine commons needed for food security and well-being, exclusion from governance, human and indigenous rights abuses, inequitable distribution of economic benefits, environmental justice concerns from pollution. This is additional to all the destructive mining on the West Coast, and cumulative impacts are unknown. The marine oil and gas sector dwarfs 9 other sectors: the marine biodiversity, tourism, transport, marine cultural heritage, defense, science, innovation, aquaculture, and wild fisheries. South Africa's key local marine ecological indicators show that 34% of South Africa's 77 commercially significant fish stocks are depleted or heavily depleted. These are 2023 DEF statistics, which tell the story of a few of our economically significant species. Our endemic African penguins are competing with commercial fisheries for sardines and anchovies, and South Africa has lost 99% of its African penguin population since the 1900s due to habitat destruction, loss of prey populations, and oil spill pollution. 42% sharks and rays are listed as threatened or endangered in South African waters. Yet are still target species listed for official permit for pelagic and demersal longline shark longliners and the KZN Sharks Board. Despite protection status, the 30 to 40 great whites caught by sharks board and more from trawl bycatch every year has substantially limited population growth since 1991. 4 out of 5 turtle species are threatened. We've lost 95% of our West Coast rock lobster population since 1910, and KZN's shallow water prawns are considered depleted largely due to the closure of the mouth of the St. Lucia estuary, blocking their recruitment onto the Utugela bank. 37% of South Africa's seabirds are threatened. South Africa has identified 3 oxygen-depleted dead zones as a consequence of increasing industrial and agricultural pollutants and nutrients, disrupting the ocean's chemical balance. Near St. Lucia Bay in the Western Cape, near Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, and near Cozy Bay in KwaZulu-Natal. Over 120 introduced marine species have been recorded, competing with and displacing local species that originate from large fishing vessels, oil rigs, and aquaculture equipment. Globally, South Africa exhibits the highest regional variability in oxygen levels, acidity, and sea temperatures. Dissolved oxygen levels are declining, while oxygen acidity and sea temperature are on the rise. Temperatures have declined along the west and south coasts due to changes in upwelling patterns from shifts in wind and rainfall patterns. Over the past decade, pelagic fish and West Coast lobster stocks are moving from west and to the east, presumably initiated by climate change. This in turn has caused dramatic declines in numbers of predatory seabirds on the West Coast colonies and corresponding increases in the size of these colonies in the south and east coast. The Fisheries Climate Change Task Team has identified the small-scale fishery as the most vulnerable to shifting stock populations due to climate change effects, which are already felt by some of the small-scale fishing communities along the coast. More intense and more frequent weather events mean that fishers have fewer days to fish or fishing in worse conditions, putting them at greater risk to make a living. Human-centered relations with the ocean need immediate and radical change, since massive species extinctions hang in the balance. Patently, the sustainable ethos is not working. If we don't colonize the blue growth imperative that feeds capitalist accumulation, in which growth and development are central metrics, recognizing them as the primary cause of environmental degradation, and focus instead on democratic systemic reforms politically necessary in terms of food sovereignty, material, and energy use, these atrocities will become ever larger scale and total annihilation. The aim is to produce caring, radical reconfigurations in social relations to the ocean. How a new system trajectory may affect structures, processes, rules, and norms of ocean governance to meet the challenges of global warming needs bottom-up engagement, especially for inclusion of the most marginalized and vulnerable. COVID has taught us that the quickest route to transformation is to stop feeding capitalists' fossil fuel fetish. We need actions and continued litigation to end their scale and impact and shield the marine commons from exploitation by a handful of powerful transnational corporations. Of extreme importance, and to change the trajectory of a heating ocean, positive grassroots transformative action must challenge the offshore and land-based primary sources of greenhouse gas. Catastrophic tragedy of the ocean commons cannot be prevented without some sense of the commons in equilibrium. The long-term environmental stewardship of indigenous peoples developed through a kinship worldview that sees all life forms as sacred and sentient, that honors the wisdom of the heart and grants equal standing to rights and responsibilities, is documented around the globe. Ancient customary rights define the ocean commons as a system of use, care, and accountability. The benefits of collective management and communal property have been shown to address the subsistence rights of marginalized and subaltern members. Important benefits of traditional and fisher communal values that exist outside the logic of extractivist developmentalism recall sustainable practices, privileged access to food rather than control over it, and oftentimes a culture of the sacred, inviolable sea. Growing grassroots resistance to increasing privatizations of the commons means a critical focus away from food security to food sovereignty, which is broadly defined as placing the needs and the rights of local peoples to control their own food systems, production modes, markets, and food cultures. It ensures that the rights to use and manage territories, stock, and biodiversity are in the hands of those who produce food. It offers a credible alternative in addressing declining ecosystems and defending the interests and inclusion of the next generation. By promoting transparent trade that guarantees just incomes to all peoples, as well as the rights of consumers to control their food and nutrition, it offers a strategy to dismantle intensive corporate production and trade regime and empowers fishers. As such, First People, small-scale and artisanal fishers, Indigenous and coastal community interface with the ocean commons has the potential to act as guideline for a just social ecological transformation through a development of collective autonomy, or in other words, self-limitation. Filming in Ponderland, I was told of the customary law which holds that you don't take more from the ocean than you can carry in your hands. Ocean commons dependent communities are ever more vulnerable to accelerating closure by capitalism, the logic of limitless growth of its global markets and efforts at economic development. Social scientists claim that Indigenous marine governance is experiencing a revival. Indigenous peoples are reaffirming their cultural roots, defining and defending fishing rights and the right to consultation, creating more just ocean jurisprudence. This finding dovetails with my own research showing that the development of a counter-imaginary to the state pursuit of offshore oil and gas development in South African waters in the form of the Oceans Not Oil campaign, convergence of subsistence fishing collectives, coastal civil society groups, scientists and academics, with resistance by First Nations and Indigenous small-scale fisher and traditional healers, is giving visibility to an atavistic environmentalism, demanding an ocean-centered approach, which refuses the trade-offs of exacerbated global warming impacts, environmental harms, and cultural dispossession from neoliberal marine developmentalism. Food sovereignty is a social struggle. Its democratic perspective emphasizes the importance of dismantling oppressive structures through prioritizing community ownership, democratic decision-making, and equitable relationships, offering potential solutions to issues like overfishing and pervasive pollution. Current international agreements and laws pertaining to the ocean have been shown to perpetuate ecological and social injustices and are therefore wholly inadequate to address the global warming crisis. To achieve transformational change, a target of 30% of coastal and marine waters designated as marine protected areas or other effective conservation measures needs to be set. Some have advocated raising this to half the Earth's surface. While food sovereignty offers a compelling vision for reshaping ocean legalities and generative practices that respect and respond to conditions for livability, its viability hinges on global cooperation, strong institutional frameworks, and a nuanced understanding of local context. Implementing food sovereignty and marine commons governance requires navigating complex socio-political dynamics and overcoming resistance from entrenched economic interests. Following coal and bond, the only viable solution to impending catastrophe entails building a movement of movements in collaborative approach to activate remediating just and revolutionary transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. We can move on now to Carmen's presentation.
Thank you, Kwakazi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, thanks for joining. I'm going to approach this from a different perspective from what Janet has done. thanks, Janet. I think your presentation was really good and quite evocative. Great presentation. Our work as Masifundise, we really focus on organizing with fisher people and fishing communities. And a lot of our work is about organization building and support for small-scale fishers to use their own voice and be agent of change in their own communities, movements, and organizations. So that's the focus that I will give to the presentation. And in order to, starting from basically where Janet left off, I think it's important, and I think that is very well known at this point, that when we look at South Africa, I just want to check, am I sharing the presentation or not really? No, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to actually share. So yes. Okay, so yes, as I was saying, as Janet rightly is pointing out, when we look at the South African coastline and the ocean space, we are witnessing a lot of extractive developments. Operation Pakiza is the vehicle through which a lot of these developments are happening, but there is also other developments like mining, mineral mining in particular, that are not necessarily sort of part of the Operation Pakiza program, but they are still part of this push for extractivism, coming closer and closer to the ocean and becoming more and more a reality for fishing communities on the ground. And this is putting the very existence of small-scale fisheries at risk. When Janet showed the map where you can see, if you look at the ocean space and the coastline, there is basically no space left for the people that are depending on this resource for their livelihood and tradition and culture. I think especially as we look at policy tools, it's important to look at marine spatial planning, which is being currently developed. Marine spatial plans are being developed for different parts of the coastline. And I think it's important that when we look at this tool, we understand that marine spatial planning is about enabling extractivism. It's basically the idea that you can take the ocean and chop it into different parts, and then you can allocate different parts to different sectors. And the way this is done is also based on value, economic value that is given to a certain sector. So if we look at this as an approach, it's easy to understand how you cannot really compare the economic value of oil and gas extraction to the value of small-scale fisheries, for example. And we think that this is also part of the issue. Janet spoke quite correctly about the idea of commodification. We're seeing more and more of a commodification of the ocean, but also what I think it's important to sort of acknowledge about the developments that we're seeing in the governance of natural resources in general and in the governance of the ocean more specifically, is this increased approach of multi-stakeholderism. What is multi-stakeholderism? It's this idea that you need to bring everyone around the table. Everyone around the table, let's get all these stakeholders together, and this is where we can take decisions, we can hear everyone. But I think that when we look at these kind of approaches, which is also how, for example, the Ocean Economy Master Plan was developed by the South African government. They call it like a bring and buy, where all the sectors should just bring what they want to see happen in the ocean, and then we can just all sit together and work out a fair deal for everyone. But I think that what that does, it's diminishing and ignoring the fact that when we're looking at ocean, so-called ocean users or stakeholders, we cannot put everyone on the same table. Small-scale fishing communities, indigenous fishers that are depending on the ocean for their livelihood and the culture, they have a human rights when it comes to the ocean. Corporations, on the other hand, they might have a stake, they might have some prospecting rights or even exploration rights or production rights, but they are not having human rights related to the ocean. So I think that this kind of definition and taking in consideration these different stakeholders, and indeed separating between stakeholders and rights holders, is something that it's very important for us as we look at the ocean, but also as we look at how do we actually talk about food sovereignty when it comes to the ocean. Also, I do think that as we look at the space of the ocean and what is happening, and the concerns that Janet was so clearly exposing, I think that what we are seeing and what is becoming very worrying for us as fishers organizations and supporters is the increased use of false solutions, an increased push of false solution in the ocean space when it comes to both biodiversity and climate change. And I think, and I have to say, I do think, Janet, you mentioned 30 by 30. And indeed, that is one of the latest development in the biodiversity governance space, where there has been an agreement last year that 30% of ocean and land should be protected. There is a lot of challenges in that, not because we believe that the ocean shouldn't be protected, but because as what we are seeing happening more and more when it comes to protection and conservation of the ocean is increasing financialization of this space. What do I mean with financialization? What we mean is that more and more we are seeing the ocean being transformed into an economic asset, something that we should put a price on, because if there isn't a price on, we're not going to protect it. And we are seeing more and more on this, and I will speak a little bit more about that later on. But I did want to speak a little bit more also about the violence of conservation as we are seeing unfolding in South Africa. And I think that it's important that we have these conversations as we engage in discussions on the ocean, exactly because of the importance of conserving the environment, the importance of fighting against biodiversity depletion and climate change. But as Janet was also pointing out, if we do this without taking into consideration the social dynamics and the social relations that we have at the present, when it comes to who gets to have a say about the ocean, who has power, then we will not be able to protect the ocean in an environmentally just way or socio-economically just way. So I just want to use the example of Isimangaliso in Dwesatwebe. Isimangaliso is an World Heritage Site, wetland park that covers a big part of the northern or the north of KwaZulu-Natal coastline. And Dwesatwebe is an area in the Amatole district in Eastern Cape, situated at the mouth of the Mbashe River. In both cases, we see what we would call a conservation fortress strategy being implemented. Strategies of conservation that are really about separating people from the environment, that do not recognize how the people of the North KZN and the people of Dwesatwebe have a strong relationship with the environment, strong connection to the ocean. They are the people that have been using the ocean for the longest time, and it has a lot of significance, not just as a food source, but also as a source of and a strong element of tradition and culture, and importantly also customary rights. As we are seeing this growing push for looking at the ocean as an economic asset, as something that needs to be valued for what it can bring, we are also seeing more and more of the conservation strategies being framed around other way, sort of, I don't remember now what's the word, but basically sort of framing ecosystem services. I think that's what they're called, and pricing ecosystem services as part of economic packages, essentially. And we're seeing more of that happening also in South Africa. But often what we see, and I will speak about a couple of examples here, is also that there is an history of violent conservation. This history has been there for a long time, since colonization, when local communities and people were removed from the ocean to make space for colonizers and white-only areas where people can basically go and enjoy the ocean as tourists. And that violence that we see in conservation has continued and continues until today. For example, in Semangaliso, in 2021 and 2022, we have seen the murder of Kalempilo Mnduli and Tulani Mnduli, who has disappeared. This is two brothers from the Nibela fishing community who found themselves, harassed and criminalized and eventually killed at different times in the same area, in the same lake, Nibela fishing. And up until today, we haven't seen any form of justice coming to the Mnduli family. In fact, all the investigations and the processes, the legal process around this have been completely stalled. In the Sakwebe, where this is an important site for the struggle of fishers, because in 2018, the Supreme Court of Appeal recognized that the Sakwebe fishing community had proved customary fishing rights, customary fishing management. They indeed were recognized as the customary fishers of the area. And even in fact, the Supreme Court of Appeal told the government that they had to regulate and implement regulations in a way that would recognize the customary rights. But despite this big court victory, we are still seeing a lot of violence and harassment coming to the people of the Sakwebe. And in particular, we were able to document how a group of young people from Ndwane was brutalized in 2021 as they were stopped from fishing in the Mbashe River, and they were tied up and their heads covered and horribly beaten up. And then also in 2022, in December 2022, we had another case where in Pume, so still in the West Twebe area, still on the Mbashe River, where 3 fishers were shot by park rangers, and this resulted in one of them, Tubilen Puzi, being disabled and not able to work anymore. He spent more than a year in hospital. So why I'm putting some focus here? I'm putting some focus here because I think in a space like this where we are talking about food sovereignty, but also climate justice, I think it's important that we question and we engage with environmental organizations in understanding what the role they also play in there. And importantly, I think that when we're looking at how do we solve the issues that we have in the ocean when it comes to climate change, but also to the deep inequities that we see in how the ocean space is used and who gets to benefit and profit from that space, we are seeing more and more of financialization of nature, using nature to and using marine protected areas or other form of protections to do carbon offsetting, and a few other full solutions where basically protection of the environment has been separated by the socioeconomic aspect for the people that live in those areas, and importantly is being separated, or that there is a push to try and do conservation in a way that is fitting with the logic of global capitalism. And if we do that, if we allow that to go ahead, also as environmental organizations, the risk is that we're not going to see any improvement, and we're not going to see any actual shift in the exploitation of nature. So I thought that this was important to highlight when we're looking at challenges. It's important that we also look at conservation critically, and we think about how do we do conservation properly and how do we do it together with local communities. So yes, I think that we have now spoken or covered a lot of the challenges that we see in the ocean space. But I think it's also important that we think about the real examples that we have here in South Africa of how fishery struggles have resulted in resistance to ocean grabbing. And also, I think that especially because we are talking about food sovereignty, one of the key pillars of food sovereignty is to value food providers. And I think that the history of the fisheries movement here in South Africa has some food for thoughts for us to consider and to think about as we think about how are we going to deal with all these challenges moving forward. So in 1998, post-apartheid South Africa, the Marine Living Resources Act was was developed to basically manage the ocean space, and in particular fisheries as well. And there was a big issues with this act because basically only recognized three types of fishing: commercial, recreational fishing, and subsistence fishing. Now, when we talk about subsistence fishing in the way it's defined in the Marine Living Resources Act, we are really talking about fish to mouth. Basically, you can, on a subsistence permit, you will be able to only catch very few fish and with very strict bag limits, very similar to what a recreational permit will be. And importantly, you will not be allowed to sell the fish, not even locally. So this lack of recognition for small scale, and I'm putting small scale in brackets here because I think that there is a lot of contentions these days about what small scale means and how do we, why are we talking about small scale? We also using other terms. We do talk about fisher people, and that's, I think, where we're the most comfortable these days. But I think that it's important to understand that when we're talking about small scale in the context of the struggle, we're really talking about local fishing communities that claimed the rights to be able to live off the ocean. So, fish to put food on the table, but also fish for livelihood purposes, and so be able to sell locally and be able to basically use the fishing as their form of work and income, and also with a strong cultural connection to the fishing. But so it was between 2002, 2005 that fishing communities in the Western Cape started to organize themselves around this issue of lack of recognition, and also created the community-based organization and the movement that is called the Coastal Links. And they went on with the support of Masifundise to launch a class action at the Quality Court. This is what is called or is known as the Kenneth George case. This was a victory for the fishers because the Quality Court essentially instructed the government to develop a policy that would recognize small-scale fisheries and especially small-scale fishing communities. And the process of developing this policy, I'm not so sure how many other policy developments have happened in the same way in South Africa. I can say that when it comes to small-scale fisheries and fisheries more generally, the process that unfolded between 2007 and 2010 in South Africa is regarded as one of the most inclusive and participatory processes when it comes to policy development for fisheries. And indeed, this policy development, there was a bottom-up process with participation of fishers from all 4 coastal provinces, culminated in the gazetting of the small-scale fishery policy, which then led to the amendment of the Marine Living Resources Act, so that the act itself could recognize small-scale fishers and, importantly, also customary rights of fisher people. This was 2014 when the amendment happened. Between 2016 and 2024, indeed, it was just recently finished in this year. we have seen the broken promises of the implementation of this small-scale fishery policy. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But before I do that, I did want to really highlight how the small-scale fishery policy, in our view, is a very good example of what public policy for food sovereignty could look like, and especially what public policy for food sovereignty can look like in the context of the ocean. So the policy is, in my opinion, a beautiful document, something that, again, even at global level is regarded as one of the most progressive fishery policy worldwide. And the reason why we think it's such a good tool for public policy when it comes to food sovereignty, it's because it really speaks to all the pillars of food sovereignty. And it does so without mentioning food sovereignty per se, but it brings all those elements. So indeed, the policy goal was to recognize customary rights and the rights and guarantee the rights of those that depend on the natural resources for food. It has an holistic and human rights-based approach. And so when we're talking about this small-scale fishery policy, we're not just talking about how do we get fish out of the water. We're also talking about social development. We're also talking about value chain. We are talking about gender equity. And indeed, the goal of the policy was to contribute to poverty alleviation, food security, and local socioeconomic development. I think that what the policy also does quite well is to really recognize the interdependence between the social, cultural, economic, and ecological dimension of the fishery systems. So in other words, there is a strong connection between the people that are involved in small-scale fisheries, their culture, and the economic and socioeconomic value of the fisheries, together with the ecology of the system as well. The policy speaks about co-management, participation in decision-making. The idea of co-management is really about having fishers themselves as right holders, engaging with government, participating with government in the management of the local resources, and making decisions about fish stocks, and making decisions about how much are we going to get out, how are we going to protect, where is that we need to sort of close fisheries, for example, or, taking decision essentially on how to best manage the resource in a way that it's conducive both for the people and the environment. The policy also speaks about equitable and preferential access for small-scale fishers. I do think that this is a tool that we have, that we as Masfundisi, but more generally, we haven't used enough, because the policy actually speaks about preferential access. So when we are looking at all these activities happening in the ocean, where is the space for small-scale fishers? I think that that's where this preferential access can really help us with. And also the policy has an approach of community-based rights. And the idea is indeed that when we're looking at fishing communities, we cannot talk about individual fishers. We should rather speak about fishing communities as a whole, and for the communities to hold these rights as a whole. This was the intention. Unfortunately, the implementation has gone in a very different way. But yes, this was the intention and the goal of the policy. We also speak about a multi-species approach. So in this sense, the idea was to walk away from the current management system of fisheries that focuses on single species approach. In other words, all the fisheries are managed as a single fisheries, as opposed to in their connection with each other. And especially for small-scale fishers, this is not viable, because small-scale fishers don't just go for one species. They go for what is available in the space, and therefore the policy was trying to create a conducive environment when it comes to permits to allow for the fishers to do so. And yes, and then finally, the policy speaks about recognizing indigenous local knowledge, and also speaks about value chain approach. So the idea that we should develop local value chains where especially women and youth can get involved. So yes, I think that this is, I do think that the policy is a very important tool for us. and it's a tool that at this stage, as we're seeing the implementation going horribly wrong, we also questioning, how do we actually get back on track? And to do that, there will be necessary to have a big shift, because as we look at the current fishery management, as I mentioned, we're really looking at single species approach. We are looking at a separation between commercial and non-consumption approach. So again, not really changing from the idea that you either do commercial fishing or subsistence fishing. I think that it's important also to know that when we look at the fishery scientist and fishery management that is involved in making decisions around the use of the resources that we have in the ocean, we have still people in the department, they scientists, talking about the tragedy of commons. So still talking about the idea that in order to save the environment, to save the ocean, to manage fish stocks, you should privatize those fish stocks. You should create quotas, individual quotas, and that would take care of defending the environment, that you should apply economic approaches to the natural resources, and that will help us to take care of the environment. These approaches are not new. They've been around from the 80s at least. And I think that it's really problematic that we are still living in a situation where the top scientists working at the department use this terminology, use this framework to make decisions on how to best allocate ocean resources. So that is where we are in terms of the fisheries management. The implementation of the policy, I mean, I could speak about that for hours, but I think it's sufficient to say that there was a lack of meaningful implementation of the policy, because only certain parts of the policies were implemented. They were about recognizing fishes, which was very important, but even the way collective rights have been established, it was a very top-down approach. And we are now in a situation where there is, on one hand, some communities where there is very few fishes, and for them, in order to operate, they had to join cooperatives with communities, the next community that maybe is 4 or 5 hours away. So how can they manage together? It's very difficult, and it's a big question mark. But then also, when we look at the implementation, all the important aspects that would have, transformed the small-scale fishery policy or activate the food sovereignty aspect of the small-scale fishery policy, including co-management, including development of local value chains, including gender equity, they have been completely left behind. And I think importantly, also preferential access is something that is not being even mentioned at governance level through and government. And so I think that when we're looking at the ocean and the commons and its function of producing food, I think that it's really important that we have a massive shift that is needed and that happens, so that we start looking at fish not as a commodity, but fish as food. Fish as food, fish as something that has a cultural value, and that it can be a vehicle for local economic development and much more resilience economies than what has been now proposed when it comes to the ocean. I mean, when we're looking at the extractivism that is happening, a key factor that is always pushed for is this idea of job creation. And, when we're looking at what kind of jobs, we are looking at construction works, we are looking at cleaning jobs for very few people in few communities. And when we're looking at small-scale fisheries and development of value chains around small-scale fisheries, that's where we see the opportunity to have a much more collective economy, and that is also delivering on socioeconomic development and not just on the GDP. Yes, when it comes to co-management, this is something that is really important for us, and that we think that it's a key element of how we need to see the ocean management transforming. But what is worrying for us right now is that when we talk about co-management, it's really about democratic participation. And it's really about the participation of the fishers as human rights holders. But at the moment, all the examples that are emerging of co-management in South Africa are being driven by environmental NGOs, being environmental NGOs. One example is WWF working in Port St. John's with the department, and we are receiving reports from fishers on the ground. They have not been really involved in the development of these co-management structures. And there is other examples also in Isimangaliso. So again, when we're talking about co-management, we need to be very clear about what it is that we're talking about. And this is about democratic participation in the management and of the resource. We need to see preferential access for small-scale fishers becoming a reality. And together with that, a real recognition of customary rights and local indigenous knowledge. At the moment, we have a situation where the department speaks about having recognized customary rights, but at the same time, again, imposing a top-down approach on how people should organize themselves within their rights to use the ocean. And then in closing, I do want to say that I think that I agree completely with Janet around the issue of alliance building. Janet, you spoke about a movement of movements, and I think that's a nice way to put it. But yes, what we always say as Masifundis and Coastal Link is that we're not going to win this struggle for the protection of the ocean for the use of the local people. And yes, it's cultural and economic value. We're not going to protect that if we are working by ourselves as fishers. I think that this is what was really great to see in the last few years with people coming together and rallying behind the fishers when it came to protecting the ocean from oil and gas exploration. But importantly, we think that it's important to create alliances with other small-scale food producers and working people. So the working class people, the majority of this country, and this also for us includes extractivism affected communities. So, and to do so in terms of what we are planning and how we're thinking about all of this, we do think that we are at a very pivotal moment when it comes to the ocean and when it comes to the survival of small-scale fishers and more broadly fisher people. And this is why, as Masifundis, together with Coastal Links and others, we will be hosting a Fishers People Tribunal, which will take place in August. And I hope to see some of the comrades here participating and joining us then. And importantly, the tribunal is going to be an hearing where fishers from different areas will be speaking about the issues they're facing and how these human rights violations are impacting on them. And after the hearing in October, we will have a conference. The idea of this Fishers People Conference will be really to look at how do we move forward from where we are now. Considering the challenges that we are facing, there is a need for a strategic shift, a shift in the approach of the struggle, in a shift in the way we think about legal tools around the fisheries, the way we think about development altogether. So this is what really we want to do with this conference, to bring together as many people as possible, fishers, but also other communities and people working on these issues, and importantly, other working class communities and movements, and to think together, how do we build an alliance and a collective campaign and vision on how to move forward in protecting the ocean and advancing food sovereignty when it comes to the ocean commons. So yes, this is where we are. I think that there is a lot more we can discuss, but I'll stop here. And yes, thank you.
Thank you, Carmen and Janet, for your very great presentations. I'm now going to open up the floor to questions. You can text questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will acknowledge you. Thank you. Janet, please go ahead.
My question really is to Carmen, just to say, you know, this is a space where I've been busy working at the moment, and I'm really needing input, just in terms of thinking around a policy, imagining if, because I think I've always believed one can't achieve anything unless one has a vision for it. And, you know, you can fight, but there's no point fighting unless you're fighting for something. So if one had a magic wand for an ocean policy, what would it look like? That's really my question.
Thanks, Janet. A very easy question to answer. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's, you're right. It is important that we are looking at, you know, we always speak also with the fishers about, okay, we can speak about our challenges, but also we need to speak about solutions, right? And I do think that the small-scale fishery policy has quite a bit of elements in itself that are important and will look like, you know, I would say they would constitute the basis for an ocean policy, or, you know, like how do we think about the ocean in terms of from a governance point of view and legislation. And I think that a key element in that is democracy and democratic practices, and how do we actually include people in making decisions around how the ocean is used. So I think that that's one of the key challenges we're facing right now, where we continue to see a government making decisions around the ocean space in a way that is completely detached from the needs and the wants of local communities. We spend so much time in the last few years saying no, expressing our right to say no to harmful development like oil and gas and mining, but also, you know, when it comes to conservation, we are seeing a way of doing conservation that is really detached from people. So I do think that an important element of this ocean policy would be democratic participation, and democratic participation especially of the people that depend on the ocean for their livelihood and culture. I think another element that we have to look at is how do we ensure equitable local economic development? Because while we see that the coastline is one of the key areas of economic development in many ways, whether it is through tourism or through extraction, we do see that the majority of these developments don't really result in material improvements in people's lives. So I do think that that's another element. And then I think that when it comes to conservation and how do we think about how to do conservation, again, I think that one of the biggest cries that fishers have, it's how they are not feeling heard by scientists, and especially fishery scientists, as they feel that they have a lot of knowledge about the ocean and the patterns in the climate, and you know, so many aspects of the ocean, and they have knowledge to offer, and they are willing to offer this knowledge. Also because they are on the sea every day, whereas scientists are not. Oftentimes, and therefore, you know, they feel that not only their voices in terms of the knowledge is being ignored, but also, you know, it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive because the way fisheries have been managed doesn't really make sense, and is not producing the outcomes that were wished for. I think a big example of this is, for example, the abalone, and how There hasn't been any significant recovery of the abalone fishery, even though it's been closed for many years now. So yes, I think those three elements will be starting points for me in thinking of what could be, food sovereignty based ocean policy. Yes, but happy to discuss more.
Thank you for that, Carmen. We have a question in the chat. I think it's directed to both Janet and Carmen. So it says, how can marine protected areas be established and managed in a way that benefits local communities and protects marine ecosystems rather than being imposed without consultation and criminalizing local communities? I think either one of you can take that, or both.
I'll step in. Carmen, where you go?
Janet, you can go first, and I can always add. Or maybe Janet, please go ahead.
I don't know if you can see me there. Anyway, just to say that I think it's a bottom-up process. And exactly what Carmen is saying, there's a lack of communication here. So there's a lack of linkage. And I think it's actually, dare I say, it's probably it's definitely classist, but it's probably also racist, where there is a lack of communication across groupings in sharing knowledge. I mean, imagine, for me, if we as the climate justice charter movement as a whole are going to move forward with any kind of ocean policy, it has to involve getting all of these people in the room, because they're all experts. You'll have a climatologist, but you also have a climatologist who's bringing in the fish, who is seeing what's happening. Those two things, those people need to sit and be able to speak the same language, without recrimination, without judgment, to be able to say, okay, we're looking for solutions. How do we find solutions here? What are the best ways to do this? So for me, it's a communication issue, and setting up fora which is not top down, which involves grassroots experts and locals in the same space. And it's not a space, it's an equal space. So everyone has equal space to talk. Yeah, and I think one has to also be conscious of land rights too. I mean, Dwesikwebe was a fundamental one, where people were shifted off the land. That's now a fenced community, a fenced conservation area, which is almost impenetrable. I approached it a couple of New Year's ago, and the New Year's celebration was happening at the one gate, and it was just impenetrable. We literally had to push through the bush, because the paths hadn't been maintained and the gates hadn't been maintained. This for me is a failed solution. More and more we're seeing fences globally, and I don't think they're going to solve any problems. I think we need to engage rather than fence off. Right, I'm silent.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. If I can add, I think sometimes, when we are in the conversations around conservations, I often feel that somehow we forget that fishers actually have a stake in protecting the ocean, because they depend on it. And I think that, as we look at the practices of small-scale fishing communities, and especially customary fishers, but traditional fishers all over the coastline, there is so much wealth of knowledge and practices around how communities have historically managed the resources without necessarily having to close them off. They have developed systems around, and indeed, when you're talking about customary fishing rights, what we are really talking about is customary management practices around the fisheries, where, you know, there is a local laws and ways of doing things that are actually based on the protection of the ocean. And, you know, if you take more than what you have to take, there will be a way the community sanctions you. And so on, and from there is management systems, committees that were created. Importantly, I think it's important to say that not traditional leaders are not necessarily involved in those. It's really the fishers. I think that what we are seeing that is quite concerning for us as things are developing, both in terms of fishery management and conservation, is that these Western tools, you know, are applied to the context of South Africa coastline, and in general, I think in a lot of places in the global South, without really appreciating what is already existing there, and in fact, breaking down a lot of those systems. This is one of the main concerns we have, you know, like in a few years, we will not be able to talk about customary fishing rights anymore, because those management practices are being completely broken down through this top-down approach to governance. So I think that bringing some of those elements back, and there are many examples in the continent on how conservation can be done in a way that is conducive and participatory, and you know, puts local communities and their need at the center. So, you know, I think that those are examples we could look at, and yes, they do require a lot more participation, a lot more time, and a lot more investment, for a lack of a better word, in the processes, but they also can result in much better outcomes for the oceans. Because also I think that what we don't often hear about is how marine protected areas are not exactly a very successful tool when it comes to ocean protection. There is studies on this that one can look at. But yes, I mean, it's really about how do we make this viable. And yes, I agree with Janet that, you know, we need to start from the grassroots, and participation of local communities is key.
Thank you for that, Carmen. We have a second question in the chat. So my question is, we know that experts help in situations such as finding solutions to the violation of local communities' rights. But is there perhaps an element of the local communities not trusting experts? I would imagine that more intervention may be unwanted in some cases. And if so, how do you circumvent such issues as an academic that wants to help?
Janet, maybe I'll start and you can come in. Thanks. I think that this is a very good question. And there is a lot that can be said on this. Look, I think that it's also important that we don't, you know, when I say fishery scientists and the distrust, I do want to emphasize that we are talking about also those fishery scientists that have power as they actually participate in the management of the resources at government level. And, you know, you can see in many of the communities we work with how angry these fishers are at the scientists. And I think that's not because they don't necessarily want to take the advice, but because they feel that their voices have been unheard. And I think especially when we're talking about fishery management, and this is by own admission also from government, some of the modeling that is used, it's very old, sometimes even 20 years old. And the fishers are on the water almost every day, and they are seeing things that maybe scientists are not seeing, and they feel that they are not being heard. I think that when it comes to more generally, the space of, or the connection between so experts and fishers and local communities, I think it's important to acknowledge that in the last years, we have seen, I mean, since I started working on Massimo Fondise 8 years ago, I cannot say how many requests we have gotten over time of students or PhD or even more experienced academics wanting to work with fishers or, you know, be around fishers. And what we hear in fishers say is that that oftentimes they feel that these processes also extractive in themselves. You know, we hear them saying, oh, they came here, they did their research that maybe resulted in their PhD or in their master, resulting in a career, and we never hear back from them. And there is no solidarity with us when it comes to our issues. So I do think that if you know, we want to talk about how do we do research, how do we do academia in a way that it's helpful to communities. It's really about listening to communities, showing up for them, not just, you know, in terms of producing research, but also in other contexts. And we do have a lot of brilliant academics in South Africa that do exactly this every day. And yes, I mean, try to always start from the basis of understanding that communities have a strong relationship with their land and with their waters, and they themselves, they want the best when it comes to protecting those resources and those commons. And I think that starting from those conversations, there is a you know, a lot of power that can be built in walking that roads again when it comes to knowledge production.
Okay, so we have another question in the chat. So Judy says, thank you for your great presentations. There are so many international well-known champions of the ocean who are gathering behind the 30-30 idea. I mean, who really care about ocean health and would not want financialization of nature or to destroy the livelihoods of small-scale fishers. It is really important that these champions hear your important messages. How are we going to get everyone in the room, as Janet says? Can you point us to some good write-ups on this issue? I think this might be for Janet.
Hi, Judy. I think the simple answer to that is invite people into the room. You know, this is something that I've certainly would like to be able to do, is to look at people who are contributing into this area of knowledge and invite them into the room for maybe 3 or 4 days, you know, looking for funding for that. I think it would be fundamental and really, really important for a way forward for South Africa. But it is a case of allowing people the space to talk. So break-offs, workshopping, and decent translation, and yeah, no, you know, working at as a democratic system where people are allowed to talk. Write-ups, there are quite a few. Sure, yeah, you know, one would have to look at this, but a lot of it's academic. We're in quite an interesting zone in this space here that we're talking about here, where there's quite a lot of hands-on, and we also have a resistance movement that's active. So we're in this really interesting space internationally, and we've got eyes on us, and it makes it really exciting. So in some respects, we carving some of the spaces, but there, you know, there have been, you know, food sovereignty is a South American concept that's been around since, you know, the 90s, even earlier. Obviously, it's traditional, but popped into academia since the 90s, 91, I think. So yeah, cool. I wanted to ask Carmen something as a feminist, because I've just in my own experience, we have a lot of female fishers, certainly in spaces where we have meetings and leaders arrive and people who engaged and interested and can have access to meetings. A lot of women are in those meetings. My own work on the coast and engaging with people, I'm meeting a lot of women fishers. You know, obviously you get these big groupings of men that go out to sea, but land-based, you know, shoreline, we're seeing a lot of, I've certainly seen a lot of women fishers. And here in KZN, I mean, you have a large Indian community also who are fishing, and a lot of them are women. So not a lot, but a proportion of them are women. Do you think women are well represented in subsistence, small scale, artisanal fisheries in South Africa?
Yeah, it's a good question, and also maybe I'm going to take this occasion for those who are not aware to also remember Celine Smith. Janet, I know you have met her many times. She passed away a few weeks ago, and she has been a key leader for the fisher movement here in South Africa, but also, and not just as a fisher movement, she also really brought that feminist gender perspective to the struggle, which, you know, just as you were asking that question, Janet, that's immediately my thoughts went there. And yes, I think it's good to remember Celine and her work whenever possible. And so I think that, yes, I agree with you. There is a lot of fisher women. And indeed, this is also where, you know, when talking about the fisheries and, you know, we've been resisting the idea of fishermen. We need to speak about fisher, because there is a lot of women also involved, especially when it comes to mussel harvesting and other onshore-based activities. And so, where are they well represented? I do think that I agree with you again. When you look at the fishers movement in South Africa broadly, we have a lot of very powerful women leaders leading on the struggle, leading on the charge. Many of the fishers representatives that were part of developing the small-scale fishery policy were fisher women. And they have historically had this function also within the communities, as you know, many of the men who, as they went out at sea on the boats, their role was also being on land and sort of advocating for the rights of their families. Having said this, I do think that right now we are not seeing any conducive environment for women fishing. I think that indeed one of the cases that we are working on when it comes to the tribunal is exactly looking at the role of women and how, on one hand, climate change. And this is the case we're going to look at is how the floodings in 2022 have impacted mussel harvesters in South KZN, and commodification, because as we're seeing more and more of a commodification of the value chain around fisheries more broadly, but also small-scale fisheries, we are seeing women being pushed out of the value chain and being pushed out from the traditional roles within the fisheries that often were in the post-harvesting and selling of the fish aspects. So I do think that while there is a lot of active women fishing all over the coastline, they are still being erased when you know, policies that are meant to recognize them are not implemented, or even you know, when the commodification of fishing is taken to such an extreme where women are sort of being skipped in the value chain because there is consolidation of these value chains in the hands of few companies. I don't know if this answers your question, Janet, but yeah.
Yes, thank you. I didn't know about Celine, so yeah, that's very sad. You know, I remember filming her at a meeting up here recently, and yeah, we remember her dynamism.
Okay, so we have another question from Charles. He says, thank you for these powerful insights. Could you both elaborate on the various ways in which marine pollution is posing a threat to the oceans in South Africa, from plastic waste, chemical pollutants, raw sewage spills, and their impacts on marine ecosystems, biodiversity, human health, and of course, coastal communities?
I'll go first if that's okay, because we've just had a renewal of the UPL disaster here. The UPL fertilizer factory, fertilizer supply. It's an enormous Indian company that came to KZN and built a factory that managed to skip regulations, and during the burning of it, during the riots, spilt out its contents, that, you know, all the water from putting out the fire then spilt the contents further downstream into the local major wetland area. And you know, I've got footage of it just wiped. It was turquoise and wiped out all the fish. We in Durban have a lot of sewage spill over into the harbor and into tributaries around Durban, and it's decimating. So yeah, we're certainly seeing it. Let me just go back to the UPL spill. When it happened, there was a local lawsuit from local residents who were affected, respiratory issues, and they were affected, and asked me to get a plant pathologist involved, who had followed UPL and spoke about forever toxins. And when these toxins end up in the water and in wetland areas, they're there forever, and they are toxic forever, and you know, they're carcinogenic. So yeah, I mean, this is land-based regulation that managed to get skipped and caused mayhem. So we're seeing quite a lot along KZN. I recently went down to Treasure Beach to try and do some filming, and you know, you're not seeing small life on the beach at the moment. We're just seeing plastic. So it's really there's a lot of plastic on our beaches. We know that fertilizers and a lot of pesticides and herbicides and plastic all come from one source, and that is petroleum based. So yeah, you know, for me, I think we need to really raise the stink around single source plastic. You know, our breweries and our suppliers of, we should be getting Unilever involved. We should be getting the soft drinks manufacturers involved in shifting single-use plastics, but across the board. So a ban, I mean, it's been done, and it's just a case of knuckling down and trying to get a single-use plastic banned. Yeah, so it's definitely an issue. It's killing marine life, and it's adding to those dead zones around South Africa, for sure. Yeah, it's a huge section, and I didn't go into it because you know, there's just so many different parts to marine pollution, but essentially so much of it boils down to hydrocarbons.
Yes, I don't think I have much more to add from what Janet has said, and indeed, you know, I think also we don't really carry that expertise around. We don't work on pollution as such as an organization, but what we can see, and I think that, you know, adding to what Janet is saying, one, a lot of these sorts of pollutions are coming from the same source, which is oil, and now oil is used in different ways, but then also how some of these sorts of pollutions are really connected to the current mainstream mode of production, which is a capitalist system mode of production. So the use of single plastics, the use of fertilizer, the lack of infrastructure around sewage, for example. I do think that they are all connected in the same, in the fact that they are part of how this economic system operates. So I do think it's important that these are addressed as single-based issues, but also in the entirety, and that we do create those connections as we fight against pollution as well. Thanks.
Thank you for those answers. I don't think we have any more questions unless someone wants to interject. But we'd just like to thank the two panelists who took the time to speak to us today. It was very, very illuminating. And it was a very, very important conversation for us to have together. But we can close the meeting for today.
All right, thank you so much. And yes, take care, and looking forward to more conversations in future.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you.
And I'm hoping that maybe we can join forces to get those people in the room. I think it would be really great if we could, if that's something that we could organize. Can you imagine how exciting that would be if we get, you know, I'm not talking small amounts, I'm talking, you know, a couple of hundred people in the room. It could be really, really exciting. Yeah.
Let's talk. Yes. Sure. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, CJCM, for organizing.
Thanks. Bye.